I never imagined that a simple neighborhood Halloween event would unveil such a disturbing secret hidden behind the perfect suburban facade of one of our neighbors. What started as an innocent trick-or-treating organization turned into a year-long nightmare that would test the strength of our community and my own resolve to protect an innocent child. Even now, as I share this story with you, my hands still tremble when I remember the moment everything changed, the moment when I realized that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live 3 houses down and drive their children to school in luxury SUVs. The events I'm about to share with you happened just over a year ago, but they've left scars on our community that may never fully heal. And they've taught me lessons about motherhood, courage, and the masks we all wear that I'll carry with me forever. You know how we all have that ideal image of suburban life, the white picket fences, the manicured lawns, the friendly waves between neighbors as we collect our morning newspapers. That was exactly what drew my husband Michael and me to Maplewood, a picturesque suburb nestled just outside Portland, Oregon. We were young parents then, full of dreams and hopes for our growing family, convinced we had found the perfect place to raise our children away from the chaos and dangers of the city. The streets were lined with mature oak trees that created tunnels of green in the summer and painted the world in golds and reds each fall. Every house had a story. Every family had their traditions, and we couldn't wait to become part of this tapestry of suburban American life. I was 34 years old when this story began, though the events that unfolded would age me in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. My daughter Emma had just turned 8, a bright, curious child who devoured books faster than I could buy them and asked questions that sometimes left me scrambling for answers. She had my brown eyes but her father's analytical mind, always wanting to understand not just what things were but why they were. Our son Lucas was 6, still young enough to believe in magic, but old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, a distinction that would prove crucial in the days to come. He was our gentle soul, the kind of child who would carefully relocate spiders outside rather than let anyone hurt them, who cried when he accidentally stepped on a flower. Michael worked as a software engineer for a tech company downtown, leaving early each morning with his coffee thermos and returning just in time for dinner most nights. He was the steady rock of our family, the one who could fix anything from a broken toy to a broken heart with equal patience and skill. I had taken a step back from my career as a marketing manager when Lucas was born, choosing to work part-time from home so I could be more present for our children. It was a decision that sometimes left me feeling isolated and unfulfilled, watching my former colleagues climb corporate ladders while I climbed playground equipment, but one I never regretted, especially after what happened that Halloween. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people still borrowed cups of sugar from each other, where children played together in the cul-de-sac until the streetlights came on, where we celebrated each other's joys and supported each other through hardships. We had block parties in the summer, progressive dinners in the winter, and the kind of casual friendships that developed from years of watching each other's children grow up. At least that's what I believed until I discovered the rot hidden beneath the surface. The secret that one of our neighbors had been hiding behind her perfect smile and designer clothes. It was early October when I volunteered to organize the neighborhood trick-or-treating route. I'd always loved Halloween, the one night when imagination ruled and anyone could be anything they wanted. Growing up, my mother had made all our costumes by hand, staying up late with her sewing machine to transform us into whatever our hearts desired that year. I wanted to create those same magical memories for the children in our neighborhood, to give them something to look back on fondly when they were adults with children of their own. I threw myself into the planning with enthusiasm that surprised even me. Maybe it was because I needed a project, something to make me feel useful beyond packing lunches and checking homework. I created a detailed map of our neighborhood, marking which houses would participate, where we'd have rest stops with hot cider for the parents and juice boxes for the kids, even coordinating with some neighbors to create themed displays in their yards. I wanted it to be perfect. every detail considered, every child included. The response from the other parents was overwhelmingly positive. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, offers to help, and excited chatter about costume ideas. Mothers shared Pinterest boards full of creative DIY costumes. Fathers volunteered to set up safety lighting along darker stretches of sidewalk, and even the elderly couple at the end of our street, the Johnsons, wanted to participate by handing out their famous homemade popcorn balls. In my message to all the parents, I had been clear but friendly about costume expectations. I wrote that costumes should be fun and creative, but also appropriate for a long evening of walking. Children needed to be able to see clearly, move freely, and stay warm as the October evening grew cool. I even attached some inspiration photos I'd found, everything from clever wordplay costumes to elaborate handmade creations to simple store-bought classics. The only rule was that kids should feel comfortable and happy in whatever they wore. There was, however, one mother I secretly hoped might skip the event, though I would never have admitted it out loud, not even to Michael. Her name was Rebecca, and she lived just 3 houses down from us in a sprawling colonial that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of Better Homes and Gardens. Every blade of grass was perfectly manicured, every flower arranged with mathematical precision, every shutter and shingle absolutely pristine. The house was a reflection of its owner, beautiful on the surface but somehow cold, lacking the lived-in warmth that made a house a home. Rebecca was 42 years old, though she'd had enough work done that she could pass for early 30s in the right light. She'd moved to our neighborhood 3 years ago, after a messy divorce from her investment banker husband, arriving with a moving truck full of designer furniture and a chip on her shoulder the size of Montana. Her daughter Sophie was 5 years old, a beautiful child with honey-colored hair and eyes the color of melted chocolate, sweet and shy in a way that made you want to protect her from the world. From the beginning, Rebecca had made it clear that she considered herself above the rest of us. She would arrive at school pickup in her white Mercedes, always perfectly dressed in athleisure that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her hair blown out like she'd just left a salon, her nails freshly manicured in whatever color was trending that week. She had a way of looking through people rather than at them, as if we were all just part of the scenery in her carefully curated life. But her appearance and attitude were just the surface problems. What truly bothered me about Rebecca was how she treated people she deemed beneath her, which seemed to be everyone. I'd witnessed her reduce a teenage grocery store clerk to tears over a slightly bruised apple, berating the girl in front of a line of customers until the manager had to intervene. She'd once spent 20 minutes screaming at our elderly mailman, Mr. Peterson, for leaving a package on her porch instead of ringing the doorbell. Never mind that she'd been home the whole time and could have simply retrieved it herself. She wielded her privilege like a weapon, always ready to remind anyone within earshot about her Ivy League education, her ex-husband's connections, the exclusive private school Sophie would attend when she was older. Every conversation somehow became about her. Every interaction an opportunity to establish her superiority. If you mentioned your child's achievement, she had a story about Sophie doing it better and younger. If you talked about a vacation, she would immediately launch into tales of her European shopping trips, name-dropping hotels and restaurants most of us had never heard of. But what truly broke my heart was watching how this affected little Sophie. The child was naturally sweet and gentle, with a quiet way of observing the world that suggested an old soul. But you could see her shrinking whenever her mother launched into one of her tirades, becoming smaller and quieter, as if she could disappear entirely if she just tried hard enough. At playdates, Sophie would apologize constantly for things that weren't her fault, from spilling a drop of water to laughing too loudly. She seemed perpetually anxious about disappointing her mother, walking on eggshells even during what should have been carefree childhood moments. I'd tried to befriend Sophie separately from Rebecca, inviting her to play with Emma when I knew Rebecca had her standing appointment at the spa. But Rebecca had quickly shut that down, accusing me of trying to undermine her parenting, of filling Sophie's head with middle-class values. The fact that she said middle class like it was a disease told me everything I needed to know about her worldview. The other mothers in the neighborhood had similar experiences. Maria, who lived across the street, had once offered to include Sophie in her daughter's birthday party at the local bowling alley. Rebecca had not only declined, but had then thrown a competing party on the same day at an expensive indoor play centre, making sure to invite every child except Maria's daughter. The pettiness was astounding, but we'd all learned it was easier to just avoid Rebecca when possible rather than risk her wrath. So when my phone rang on the evening of October 30th and I saw Rebecca's name on the screen, I actually considered not answering. I was in the middle of making dinner. Emma was practicing her violin in the living room, creating sounds that were almost musical, and Lucas was building what he insisted was a rocket ship out of every pillow in our house. It was a peaceful domestic scene, and I knew Rebecca's call would shatter it. But my mother had raised me to be polite even when I didn't want to be, so I answered. Her voice started out syrupy sweet, that fake tone she used when she wanted something. She asked about the trick-or-treating plans, confirming the time and meeting location, and, for a moment, I thought maybe she was actually going to participate, like a normal neighbour. But then she asked about the route length, and when I confirmed it was about a quarter mile through the neighbourhood, her tone changed completely. She launched into a lecture about how irresponsible I was for not considering everyone's limitations. Some people, she informed me in that condescending voice usually reserved for very small children or very slow adults, actually cared about their appearance and wouldn't want to arrive at houses looking dishevelled from walking. Some of us understood the importance of maintaining standards, even on Halloween. Especially on Halloween when everyone would be taking photos. I tried to explain that we had planned rest stops along the way, that the route was designed to be manageable for young children, that we'd even have a wagon available for any little ones who got tired. But she cut me off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, sharp and designed to hurt. What came next still stings when I remember it, not because the words were particularly clever, but because they were crafted to hit where I was most vulnerable. She told me that just because I clearly needed the exercise didn't mean the rest of the neighbourhood did. Perhaps, she suggested, I should focus on my own family's health instead of organising events that inconvenienced others. She made a comment about how some of us had let ourselves go after having children, while others understood that being a mother didn't mean abandoning self-care. The implication was clear. I was fat, lazy, and a bad example for my children. I stood there in my kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, feeling that familiar hot shame creeping up my neck. It was the same feeling I'd had since middle school whenever someone commented on my body, that combination of anger and humiliation that made me want to both scream and cry. I looked down at myself, at the yoga pants that had a small stain from Lucas's lunch, at the oversized t-shirt I'd thrown on that morning, and for a moment, I let her words sink in. But then I heard Emma hit a particularly screechy note on her violin, followed by her frustrated groan and immediate attempt to try again. I heard Lucas narrating his pillow rocket's journey to Mars, complete with sound effects. I smelled the lasagna bubbling in the oven, made from my grandmother's recipe, the same one I'd eaten as a child. And I realized that Rebecca's words only had power if I let them. Something shifted in me in that moment. Maybe it was the mama bear instinct finally roaring to life, or maybe I was just tired of letting Rebecca bulldoze everyone around her. But I found my voice, and it was steady and calm, nothing like the shaking mess I felt inside. I told her in my most professional tone, the one I used to use in board meetings when dealing with difficult clients, that participation was optional, and I would be happy to remove her from the list if she preferred not to join us. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I don't think anyone had ever dismissed Rebecca so coolly, and she clearly didn't know how to respond. Before she could gather herself for another attack, I added that I hoped she and Sophie would have a lovely Halloween, whatever they decided to do, and then I hung up. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but I felt something I hadn't expected: pride. I had stood up to the neighbourhood bully, and it felt incredible. Michael found me a few minutes later, still standing in the kitchen with a dazed expression. He took one look at my face and wrapped me in a hug, not asking questions, just holding me until my breathing steadied. When I finally told him what happened, his jaw clenched in that way it did when he was really angry but trying to control it. He said he was proud of me for not letting her get to me, though we both knew she had at least a little. But that was okay. Even small victories counted. Halloween dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect October days when the air is crisp but the sun still holds warmth. I woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning putting final touches on the kids' costumes. Emma had chosen to be a scientist, complete with a lab coat I'd found at a thrift store, safety goggles, and test tubes filled with coloured water that she insisted on calling specimens. Lucas was a friendly dragon, with wings made from green fabric and wire hangers that he kept spreading to show everyone, and a tail that I knew would probably get stepped on at least once during the evening. By 5 o'clock, families were starting to gather in our driveway. The excitement was palpable, children bouncing on their toes, comparing costumes, already eyeing each other's candy buckets. Parents chatted and laughed, taking pictures, commenting on the perfect weather. Our neighbour Tom had dressed as a pirate, complete with a stuffed parrot on his shoulder that his daughter kept trying to feed candy. Maria's whole family had coordinated Disney costumes, and watching her husband try to navigate in his beast costume head was providing entertainment for everyone. I was doing a final head count, making sure every child had a buddy and every parent knew the route, when I heard the distinctive purr of an expensive engine. My stomach dropped as I recognized Rebecca's white Mercedes pulling up to my house. I had removed her from the official list, but apparently she'd decided to come anyway. Several other parents noticed too, and I saw them exchange glances, everyone wondering what drama was about to unfold. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when Rebecca stepped out of her car. She was wearing what could only be described as a Halloween costume designed for an adult party at a nightclub, not a family trick-or-treating event. It was supposed to be a French maid outfit, but the skirt was so short it barely covered her thighs. The neckline plunged almost to her navel, and the fishnet stockings and 6-inch heels completed a look that would have been inappropriate at any family gathering. But what truly horrified me, what made my jaw drop and my heart race with a combination of shock and protective fury, was seeing little Sophie climb out of the back seat wearing a miniature version of the same costume. Someone had clearly taken an adult costume and tailored it to fit a 5-year-old, maintaining all the inappropriate elements. The skirt on Sophie was just as short proportionally. The top fitted in a way that no child's clothing should ever be, and they'd even given her little heels that she could barely walk in. Sophie's face was flushed with embarrassment as she stood next to her mother, tugging desperately at the hem of her skirt, trying to pull it down to cover more of her legs. She looked around at the other children in their comfortable, age-appropriate costumes, and I could see the confusion and shame in her eyes. This wasn't what Halloween was supposed to be for a 5-year-old. This wasn't fun or magical or exciting. This was a child being used as an accessory to her mother's need for attention. The entire gathering fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what they were seeing. Parents instinctively pulled their own children a little closer, and I saw several mothers' faces shift from shock to anger. Tom's wife, Jennifer, actually covered her son's eyes. Maria looked like she might cry, and through it all Rebecca strutted toward us with a smile that said she knew exactly the reaction she was causing and loved every second of it. She made some comment about how adorable they looked in their matching costumes, how Sophie had begged to dress just like Mommy, how they were going to win any costume contest we might have. But even as she spoke, Sophie was trying to hide behind her mother's legs, clearly miserable and wanting to disappear. The contrast between Sophie's discomfort and Rebecca's preening made the situation even more disturbing. That's when I heard Sophie whisper to her mother, her small voice barely audible but filled with distress. She tugged on Rebecca's hand and said she didn't feel comfortable, that the costume was itchy and cold, that she wanted to wear something else. My heart broke for this little girl who was brave enough to speak up even though she knew it might make her mother angry. But what happened next made my blood boil. Rebecca bent down to Sophie's level, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd heard the pain in her daughter's voice and would do the right thing. Instead, she gripped Sophie's shoulders and said loud enough for several of us to hear that pain was beauty, and the sooner Sophie learned that lesson, the better off she'd be in life. She told her 5-year-old daughter that looking pretty was more important than feeling comfortable, that getting attention was worth any discomfort, that this was what women did. Something inside me snapped in that moment. Maybe it was seeing the tears gathering in Sophie's eyes, or maybe it was the collective intake of breath from the other parents around me, but I couldn't stand by and watch this happen. Without thinking, I rushed into my house and grabbed one of Emma's costumes from the previous year. A butterfly outfit with comfortable leggings, a long-sleeved shirt with sparkly wings attached, and a matching headband with antennae. It was exactly Sophie's size. I knelt down next to Sophie, ignoring Rebecca completely, and asked her if she'd like to change into something she could run and play in. I told her Emma had been a butterfly last year and had loved how the wings sparkled when she moved, how comfortable it was for collecting lots of candy. Sophie's eyes lit up with hope, and she started to nod, but before she could speak, Rebecca grabbed her arm and pulled her back. The look Rebecca gave me was pure venom, the mask of suburban perfection completely gone. But I stood my ground, meeting her glare with one of my own. Around us, other parents were watching, and I knew they were with me. Maria stepped closer, Jennifer moved to stand beside me, and even some of the fathers were paying attention now. Rebecca was outnumbered, and she knew it. I told her quietly but firmly that if she forced her daughter to remain uncomfortable in front of all these families, I would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of mother she was. It wasn't my proudest moment, essentially threatening another mother, but sometimes protecting a child requires taking a stand. I wasn't going to let Sophie suffer for her mother's twisted need for attention. Rebecca's face went through several expressions, from rage to calculation to forced acceptance. She was many things, but she wasn't stupid. She knew that her carefully crafted image would shatter if she was seen publicly forcing her crying child to wear an inappropriate costume. Image was everything to Rebecca, and being labelled a bad mother in front of the neighbourhood was her worst nightmare. With a theatrical sigh that suggested she was doing me some great favour, she released Sophie's arm. The little girl practically ran to me, and I quickly ushered her inside before Rebecca could change her mind. Maria followed us, saying she'd help, and together we got Sophie changed in my downstairs bathroom. As we helped her into the butterfly costume, she whispered thank you over and over again, and both Maria and I had to blink back tears. When Sophie saw herself in the mirror wearing the butterfly costume, her whole demeanour changed. She spread her arms to see the wings sparkle, twirled to watch the antennae bounce, and, for the first time that evening, she smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one she used around her mother. She looked like what she was, a 5-year-old excited about Halloween, and that's all any child should have to be. We returned outside to find Rebecca holding court with a couple of fathers who looked distinctly uncomfortable. She was laughing too loudly at something one of them had said, touching his arm, standing too close. Their wives were watching with expressions that ranged from annoyance to disgust. But when Sophie ran out in her new costume, twirling to show everyone her wings, even Rebecca couldn't ruin the moment. The other children immediately welcomed Sophie into their group, complimenting her wings and asking if she wanted to be their trick-or-treat buddy. Emma took her hand and promised to show her all the best houses for candy. Watching them together, my serious 8-year-old and this sweet 5-year-old who just wanted to fit in, I felt both proud of my daughter and sad for Sophie. The trick-or-treating began as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalks and making the jack-o'-lanterns glow. The children raced from house to house with boundless energy, their excited voices carrying through the crisp air. Parents followed at a more leisurely pace, carrying extra bags for candy overflow and making sure no one got left behind. For a while, everything was perfect, exactly the magical evening I'd envisioned. But I couldn't help noticing Rebecca lagging behind the main group, and what I saw made my skin crawl. She wasn't participating in the parent conversations or watching her daughter enjoy herself. Instead, she was systematically targeting every father in the group, regardless of whether their wives were standing right there. She would touch their arms when she talked, lean in too close, make comments about how strong they looked carrying their children's candy bags. Her behavior was so blatant, so inappropriate, that even the most oblivious among us couldn't miss it. I watched Tom practically sprint away from her to catch up with his wife. Another dad, James, who was recently divorced, and there with his 11-year-old son, seemed to be her primary target. She attached herself to him like a barnacle, monopolizing his attention while his son trick-or-treated alone. But what truly alarmed me were the comments she kept making about Sophie. She would gesture to her daughter and tell these men that Sophie was going to be even prettier than her when she grew up, that she was already a little heartbreaker, that she had men wrapped around her finger. The way she spoke about her 5-year-old daughter as if she was some kind of miniature seductress made me physically ill. Maria and I exchanged worried glances as we watched this unfold. We tried to stay close to Sophie, making sure she was included with the other children and away from whatever her mother was doing. But as we moved through the neighborhood, the situation escalated. Rebecca had succeeded in isolating James from the group, positioning herself between him and the rest of us, like a predator separating prey from the herd. What happened next made both Maria and me move closer to intervene. Rebecca called Sophie over to meet James and his son Tyler, and the way she did it set off every alarm bell in my head. She was using that syrupy sweet voice again, but there was something underneath it, something calculated and wrong. Sophie reluctantly left the group of children and walked over to her mother. Rebecca immediately started pushing Sophie to interact with Tyler, who looked mortified. She made comments about what a cute couple they would make, how Sophie needed an older boyfriend to protect her, how Tyler was so handsome and mature for his age. The boy, to his credit, looked extremely uncomfortable and kept trying to step away, but Rebecca would pull him back, laughing and saying he was just shy. James seemed oblivious at first, probably grateful for adult attention after his recent divorce, but even he started to look concerned when Rebecca suggested the kids should hold hands for a photo. Tyler was 11, Sophie was 5, and Rebecca was trying to orchestrate some kind of romantic interaction between them. It was beyond inappropriate. It was disturbing on a level that made my stomach churn. I couldn't stand by and watch this anymore. I walked over with Maria flanking me and made a joke about how Sophie was too young for boyfriends and should focus on her candy collection instead. I kept my tone light, but my eyes were locked on Rebecca's, making it clear I wasn't going to let this continue. Rebecca shot me another venomous look and made some comment about me being jealous because my daughter wasn't as pretty as Sophie. The absurdity of that statement, suggesting I was jealous of a 5-year-old's appearance, almost made me laugh. But the underlying implication, that physical appearance was the most important thing about our daughters, that we should be comparing their looks and grooming them for male attention, made me want to shake her. What kind of mother thought this way about her own child? The rest of the evening continued with this pattern of Rebecca making inappropriate comments and the other mothers and I running interference. We formed an unspoken alliance, making sure Sophie was never alone with any of the adults her mother was targeting, keeping her safely within the group of children where she belonged. It was exhausting, like playing defense against someone who didn't understand or care about normal boundaries. By the time we made it back to my house where everyone had parked, the children were tired but happy, their bags heavy with candy, their faces painted with chocolate and exhaustion. Parents were starting to load sleepy kids into cars, everyone sharing final Halloween wishes and making plans for next year. It should have been a peaceful end to a successful evening. That's when Sophie approached me alone while her mother was distracted trying to get James's phone number. The little girl looked up at me with those big brown eyes, and what she said next changed everything. In her innocent 5-year-old voice, she told me she wished I was her mommy instead because I was nice and didn't make her do things she didn't like. Before I could respond, before I could even process the weight of that statement, she added something that made my blood run cold. She said she missed her boyfriend, but Mommy said he had to go away because his wife found out. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were perfectly normal for a 5-year-old to have a boyfriend with a wife. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was hearing while keeping my expression neutral so as not to scare her. I knelt down to her level, my heart racing but trying to keep my voice calm and gentle. I asked her about this boyfriend, trying to understand what she meant. Maybe she was confused, maybe she was talking about a family friend she had a little crush on. But what she told me next made everything horrifyingly clear. She said his name was Robert, that he was Mommy's special friend who bought her presents. She said he was really old like a grandpa, but Mommy said that was okay because he had lots of money to spend on pretty girls like her. My hands were shaking as Sophie continued, her innocent voice describing a nightmare. She told me about how Robert would come over when Mommy had her special parties, how he would always bring her jewelry and want her to sit on his lap and tell him she loved him. She said she didn't like it because he smelled funny and his hands were always sweaty, but Mommy said she had to be nice because Robert was helping them pay for their big house. She mentioned other men too, friends of Mommy's who would bring her presents, who would want to take pictures with her, who would tell her she was pretty and special. She talked about modelling for photos in dress-up clothes that Mommy picked, about practicing walking like a lady, about learning to sit properly and smile even when she didn't feel happy. Every word was another piece of a puzzle I desperately didn't want to complete. I was trying to process this horrifying information, trying to figure out what to do next, when Rebecca appeared, grabbing Sophie's arm so hard the little girl cried out. The mask of suburban perfection was completely gone now, replaced by something feral and dangerous. She started screaming at me, accusing me of trying to steal her daughter, of being jealous and pathetic. But underneath the rage, I could see fear in her eyes because she knew Sophie had told me something. The commotion drew everyone's attention. Parents still in the driveway turned to stare, children peered out of car windows, and Michael came running from inside, where he'd been helping Emma count her candy. Rebecca tried to drag Sophie to their car, but I stepped in front of them. Something about Sophie's revelations had awakened a protective instinct in me that overrode any social politeness. This child was in danger, and I wasn't going to let her leave with Rebecca. I told Rebecca she wasn't going anywhere until we discussed what Sophie had just told me about her adult boyfriend. The words hung in the air like a bomb, and I watched as every parent in that driveway understood the implication. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Sophie's quiet crying and the distant sound of children laughing in other yards, unaware of the drama unfolding in ours. Rebecca tried to laugh it off at first, that same brittle laugh she used when she was cornered. She said I was being dramatic, that I was making something sick out of an innocent comment. She claimed Sophie just had a little crush on one of her friends, that children say silly things all the time, that we were all overreacting to a child's imagination. But her voice was too high, her movements too jerky, and everyone could see she was lying. Maria stepped forward and said she had also heard concerning things from Sophie during playdates, comments about boyfriends and presents that hadn't seemed right. Another mum, Jennifer, mentioned that she'd seen Rebecca posting photos on Instagram of Sophie in inappropriate outfits with captions about her little princess growing up too fast. One by one, parents began sharing things they'd noticed but hadn't wanted to believe, pieces of a puzzle we'd all been unconsciously collecting. Tom mentioned seeing Rebecca at the mall with Sophie and an older man, how uncomfortable he'd been with the way the man interacted with the child. Another neighbour recalled Rebecca bringing different men to school events, always introducing them as friends but never the same one twice. Even James, who'd been Rebecca's target all evening, admitted that some of her comments about Sophie had made him deeply uncomfortable. As more people spoke up, Rebecca's attempts at damage control became increasingly desperate. She accused us all of being jealous, of ganging up on her because she was prettier and wealthier than us. She threatened to sue everyone for defamation, to ruin our lives with her lawyers. She claimed we were all bored housewives creating drama, that we didn't understand the pressure she was under as a single mother. But when James mentioned that he was a mandated reporter as a teacher, and would have to call Child Protective Services based on what he'd heard, Rebecca's facade finally cracked completely. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered entirely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. She broke down, but they weren't tears of remorse or fear for her daughter. They were tears of rage and self-pity. She screamed about how we didn't understand the pressure she was under, how expensive it was to maintain her lifestyle after the divorce. Her ex-husband had hidden assets, she claimed, and the settlement wasn't enough to keep up the image she'd cultivated. She ranted about how Sophie was her only asset, how she was just trying to secure their future, how we were ruining everything she'd worked for. The fact that she referred to her own child as an asset told us everything we needed to know about how she viewed Sophie. Michael had quietly called 911 while this breakdown was happening, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. Several neighbours who hadn't been part of the trick-or-treating group had come out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Rebecca must have heard the sirens too because she suddenly tried to run to her car with Sophie, but several of the fathers blocked her path while the mothers formed a protective circle around the crying child. Sophie was sobbing now. Not the manipulative tears children sometimes use to get their way, but the deep, frightened cries of a child who knew something terrible was happening but didn't understand what or why. She kept asking why everyone was mad at Mommy, why she couldn't go home, what she had done wrong. It broke my heart that her first instinct was to blame herself. When the police arrived, our quiet suburban street was transformed into a scene from a crime drama. Multiple squad cars with flashing lights, officers in uniform asking questions, neighbours peering through windows and standing on lawns. Rebecca tried to put on her perfect mother act for the officers, speaking in her cultured voice about a misunderstanding, about neighbourhood jealousy, about how we were all conspiring against her. But there were too many witnesses, too many of us who had seen and heard things that painted a disturbing picture. The lead officer, Detective Patricia Chen, was a woman about my age with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanour. She listened carefully as we all gave our statements, taking detailed notes, asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the gravity of what she was hearing. The Child Protective Services team arrived shortly after the police, and watching them gently separate Sophie from Rebecca was one of the hardest things I've ever witnessed. Rebecca fought them at first, clinging to Sophie and wailing about her rights as a mother. But Sophie, sweet, confused Sophie, went willingly with the CPS worker when promised she could bring her butterfly wings and would be somewhere safe. As they led Sophie to the CPS vehicle, she turned back to look at me and waved with her small hand, still wearing the butterfly costume I'd given her. I waved back, trying to smile reassuringly even as tears streamed down my face. Rebecca saw this interaction and screamed that I'd stolen her baby, that this was all my fault, that I would pay for destroying her life. The officers had to physically restrain her. They didn't arrest Rebecca that night, but she was informed that Sophie would be placed in emergency protective custody while they investigated. She was given information about the legal process, about her rights, about how she could work with CPS to potentially regain custody if the allegations were unfounded. But we all knew they weren't unfounded, and deep down, I think Rebecca knew it too. The sound of Rebecca's wails as they drove away with Sophie will haunt me forever. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because even in that moment, it was all about her. She wasn't crying for her daughter's trauma or fear. She was crying for her own loss of control, her shattered image, her exposure. There was no maternal anguish in those cries, only narcissistic rage. After the police and CPS left, those of us who remained stood in my driveway in shocked silence. The Halloween decorations looked garish now in the flashing lights, the carved pumpkins grinning obscenely at the drama they'd witnessed. Parents held their own children a little tighter, and I saw more than one parent whisper "I love you" to their kids, grateful for their safety and normalcy. Michael wrapped his arms around me as I finally let myself break down. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a crushing combination of horror, guilt, and relief. Horror at what Sophie had endured, guilt that it had taken us so long to act, and relief that she was finally safe. Around us, other parents were having similar reactions, comforting each other, trying to process what had just happened in our safe little neighbourhood. The next few days were a blur of activity. Those of us who had witnessed concerning behaviour were contacted by CPS investigators and asked to provide detailed statements. I spent hours recounting every interaction I'd had with Rebecca and Sophie, every red flag I'd noticed, every comment that had made me uncomfortable. The investigator, a woman named Sarah who'd been doing this work for 20 years, said our quick action might have saved Sophie from worse abuse. What emerged during the investigation was a pattern of behavior that was worse than any of us had imagined. Rebecca had been essentially grooming Sophie for abuse, gradually normalizing inappropriate contact with adult men. She'd been taking provocative photos of Sophie and sharing them in private online groups, describing her daughter in ways that made investigators physically ill. Financial records showed regular payments from multiple men, always following visits where Sophie was present. While investigators couldn't prove physical abuse had occurred yet, the psychological and emotional abuse was undeniable. Sophie had been taught that her value lay in her appearance and her ability to please adults, particularly men. She'd been exposed to adult situations and conversations no child should ever hear. She'd been dressed up and paraded like a doll for the gratification of her mother's ego and bank account. The forensic interviewer who worked with Sophie shared some details with me later, within the bounds of what she could legally discuss. She said Sophie had been remarkably brave, answering questions honestly even when she didn't fully understand their significance. The little girl had internalized so many harmful messages about beauty and worth and what girls had to do to be loved that it would take years of therapy to undo the damage. But there was hope too. Sophie had also shown remarkable resilience, a spark of understanding that what had been happening wasn't right. She'd tried to tell people in her own way, through comments and behaviors that we'd all noticed but hadn't fully understood. The forensic interviewer said Sophie's relief at being believed and protected was palpable, that she'd actually asked if she could live with a family where she didn't have to wear uncomfortable clothes or sit on strangers' laps. Meanwhile, Rebecca went on the offensive with a vengeance that was both predictable and pathetic. She hired the most expensive lawyer in Portland, a man known for defending the indefensible, and began a campaign to discredit everyone involved. She claimed we were a cabal of jealous suburban mothers who couldn't stand her success and beauty. She posted on social media about being persecuted for being a single mother, carefully omitting any mention of why Sophie had been removed from her care. She started a blog called Mommy Martyrdom where she painted herself as a victim of the system, sharing carefully edited versions of events that made her look like a devoted mother torn from her child by jealous neighbors. She gave interviews to anyone who would listen, always perfectly styled, always crying on cue, always deflecting from the actual allegations to focus on how hard it was to be a beautiful, successful woman in a world full of haters. But her efforts to control the narrative backfired spectacularly when more people came forward. Former nannies contacted CPS with stories of being fired for questioning Rebecca's parenting. Parents from Sophie's previous preschool revealed why Rebecca had been asked to leave the program after incidents involving inappropriate dress and comments. Even her ex-husband, who lived across the country and had been painted as the villain in their divorce, provided evidence of his concerns about Rebecca's behavior that had been dismissed by the court as vengeful lies. The most damaging testimony came from a woman named Carol, who had been Rebecca's housekeeper for 6 months. She described finding Sophie in tears multiple times after Mommy's special friends left, seeing bruises on the child's arms from being gripped too tightly, overhearing Rebecca coaching Sophie on how to act around certain men. Carol had quit and considered reporting it, but had been afraid of Rebecca's threats about her immigration status. The investigation gave her the courage to finally speak up. Our neighborhood became divided during this time. Most people supported the intervention and were horrified by what had been happening under their noses. But Rebecca had her defenders too, mostly people who hadn't witnessed her behavior firsthand and bought into her narrative of persecution. They accused us of being moral crusaders, of destroying a family over nothing more than a fashion choice and some misinterpreted comments. One neighbor, Harold, was particularly vocal in Rebecca's defense. He wrote letters to the editor about the rush to judgment in our society, about how a hard-working single mother was being crucified for not conforming to suburban standards. It wasn't until his wife Margaret found text messages between him and Rebecca, including photos she'd sent him of Sophie, that he suddenly fell silent on the subject. Margaret filed for divorce shortly after. Rebecca's harassment of those of us who'd reported her escalated as her legal situation worsened. She would drive slowly past our houses at all hours, taking photos. She filed false complaints with the HOA about property violations. She spread rumors about our families on neighborhood Facebook pages, making up stories about affairs and financial troubles and our own parenting failures. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to make us regret ever challenging her. The restraining orders we eventually obtained did little to stop her. She was careful to stay just within legal boundaries, always maintaining plausible deniability. She hired private investigators to dig into our backgrounds, looking for anything she could use against us. When that yielded nothing useful, she began creating fake social media accounts to harass us online, sending messages about how we'd destroyed an innocent family, how karma would find us, how our own children would suffer for what we'd done to hers. But we had formed our own support network by then. The families who'd witnessed that Halloween night grew closer, united by shared trauma and determination to see justice done. We took turns documenting Rebecca's harassment, supporting each other through the legal process, making sure everyone felt safe. Maria organized a neighborhood watch specifically focused on protecting those of us Rebecca had targeted. It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking that such measures were necessary. Through all of this, we received updates about Sophie through official channels. She had been placed with experienced foster parents, Mark and Lisa Anderson, who specialized in helping traumatized children. The reports were cautiously optimistic. Sophie was adjusting slowly, learning what normal childhood looked like, beginning to trust that not all adults had ulterior motives. She'd started kindergarten at a new school where no one knew her story, where she could just be a regular kid. The Andersons reported that Sophie had nightmares at first, crying out for her mommy despite everything. It was a reminder that even harmful parents are still parents in a child's eyes, that trauma bonds are complex and can't be simply severed. But gradually, the nightmares decreased. Sophie began to play freely, to express preferences without fear of punishment, to understand that love didn't require payment in discomfort or compliance. One detail that particularly moved me was learning that Sophie had kept the butterfly costume I'd given her. She wouldn't sleep without the wings nearby, and the Andersons had gently washed and repaired them when they started showing wear. To Sophie, those wings represented the first time an adult had prioritized her comfort over appearance, the first time she'd been allowed to just be a child. It was a small thing, but sometimes healing begins with small things. The criminal trial was set for the following spring, and the intervening months were a special kind of torture. Rebecca's lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to get evidence thrown out, claiming illegal search and seizure, violation of privacy, conspiracy among witnesses. Each hearing meant reliving that Halloween night, defending our actions, explaining again why we'd felt compelled to intervene. Rebecca appeared at every hearing dressed impeccably, playing the role of grieving mother to perfection. She'd lost weight, making her look more fragile and sympathetic. She cried at strategic moments, clutched tissues with perfectly manicured hands, made eye contact with jury members as if begging them to understand her pain. If you didn't know the truth, you might have been fooled into feeling sorry for her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors had built a meticulous case showing a pattern of grooming and exploitation. They had financial records showing regular deposits following visits from men who'd been alone with Sophie. They had text messages where Rebecca explicitly discussed what these men wanted in exchange for money. They had photos from Rebecca's phone that no mother should ever take of her child, let alone share with strangers. Most damning was a series of emails Rebecca had sent to a friend out of state, someone she'd thought was safe to confide in. In these emails, she laid out her plan to use Sophie to maintain her lifestyle, discussing the child as if she were a business asset to be leveraged. She complained about Sophie's resistance to certain situations, strategized about making her more compliant, celebrated when a particular man increased his financial support after a successful visit. When these emails were read in court, even Rebecca's supporters couldn't maintain their delusions. The friend who'd received them had been horrified and saved them, eventually turning them over to prosecutors when she learned about the case. Rebecca tried to claim they were taken out of context, that she'd been joking, that they were creative writing exercises. But the specificity, the dates that matched financial records, the casual cruelty in her words, all painted a clear picture of intentional exploitation. I testified about Halloween night and what Sophie had told me. Sitting in that witness box, looking at Rebecca's cold eyes as I recounted her daughter's words about boyfriends and presents and having to be nice to Mommy's friends, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Rebecca's lawyer attacked my credibility, bringing up everything from my weight to my part-time work status to my children's average grades, trying to paint me as a jealous housewife who wanted to destroy a more successful woman. But I held firm, answering each question honestly, refusing to be shamed or intimidated. When he suggested I'd coached Sophie to say those things, I looked him in the eye and asked what kind of person would coach a 5-year-old to lie about adult boyfriends. The jury saw through his tactics, and several members nodded slightly when I finished my testimony. Truth has a power that no amount of legal maneuvering can overcome. Other witnesses were equally powerful. Maria testified about disturbing things Sophie had said during playdates. Jennifer shared screenshots of Rebecca's inappropriate Instagram posts featuring Sophie. The forensic interviewer walked the jury through Sophie's disclosures in heartbreaking detail. Even James, who'd been so uncomfortable with Rebecca's advances that Halloween night, testified about her attempts to push Sophie toward his 11-year-old son. The most powerful testimony came from Sophie herself, delivered via closed-circuit video to protect her from having to face her mother. The courtroom was silent as this brave 6-year-old, in her own simple words, described the men who visited, the photos Mommy made her take, the uncomfortable clothes she had to wear, the things she had to do that made her feel bad. She spoke about wanting to play with toys but having to sit still for pictures instead, about wanting to wear comfortable clothes but Mommy saying beauty was more important. When the prosecutor gently asked Sophie if she understood why she couldn't live with Mommy anymore, she said yes, because Mommy had made unsafe choices. When asked if she missed her Mommy, she said sometimes, but she liked living where she didn't have to have boyfriends or wear clothes that hurt. The innocent wisdom in that response, the fact that a 6-year-old understood on some level what had been done to her, left not a single dry eye in the courtroom, except for Rebecca's. Rebecca took the stand in her own defense, against her lawyer's advice. It was a catastrophic decision. Unable to resist the spotlight, convinced she could charm her way out of consequences as she always had, she delivered a performance that revealed her true nature to everyone watching. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, blamed everyone but herself, and showed not 1 ounce of genuine remorse for what she'd put Sophie through. She claimed the men were just friends helping a struggling single mother, that any inappropriate behavior was their fault, not hers. She said the photos were artistic, that she was fostering Sophie's modeling career. She accused all of us witnesses of conspiracy, jealousy, and lies. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. The prosecutor systematically destroyed each of her claims with evidence, catching her in lie after lie until even she seemed to realize she'd lost. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts of child endangerment, exploitation of a minor, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and multiple financial crimes, Rebecca's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. But even then, her reaction was all about her. She screamed about injustice, about her ruined life, about how we'd all pay for this. Not one word about Sophie, not one expression of concern for her daughter's well-being. At the sentencing hearing a month later, victim impact statements were read, including one from Sophie's foster parents about the long road of healing ahead. Child development experts testified about the lasting damage of exploitation and grooming. The judge, a grandfather himself, was visibly disgusted as he reviewed the evidence. He called Rebecca's crimes a fundamental betrayal of the sacred trust between parent and child. noting that she'd treated her daughter not as a person to be protected but as a commodity to be sold. He sentenced her to 15 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the plea agreement. Rebecca screamed that we'd all pay for this, that this wasn't over, that she'd get her revenge. She had to be physically dragged from the courtroom, still ranting about injustice and conspiracy. Even facing over a decade in prison, she couldn't summon a single word of remorse or concern for Sophie. With Rebecca heading to prison, the focus turned to Sophie's future. The Andersons had fallen in love with her and wanted to adopt her, but there was a legal process to follow. Rights had to be terminated, family members had to be searched for and evaluated, home studies had to be conducted. Rebecca's parents were located in Florida, but they showed no interest in taking Sophie, claiming they were too old and that Rebecca had always been difficult. More investigations revealed why Rebecca's parents wanted nothing to do with the situation. Her father had his own history of inappropriate behavior with minors, and her mother had enabled it for decades. The cycle of abuse stretched back generations, but it would stop with Sophie. The court quickly ruled out any placement with Rebecca's family, recognizing the danger of continuing the pattern. The adoption process took nearly a year, but it was worth the wait. Sophie bloomed in the Andersons' care, slowly learning to trust, to play, to be a child without conditions or expectations. She started therapy with a specialist in childhood trauma, working through the messages she'd internalized about beauty and worth and what love looked like. Progress was slow but steady, marked by small victories like the first time she chose comfort over appearance, or when she finally believed she was loved for who she was, not what she looked like. I stayed in touch with the Andersons throughout this process, as did several other families from that Halloween night. We became Sophie's extended support system, showing her that communities could be safe, that adults could be trusted, that she was valued for so much more than her appearance. When she scored her first soccer goal, half the neighborhood was there cheering. When she struggled with nightmares, we rallied around the Andersons with support and resources. The adoption was finalized just before Sophie's 7th birthday. The courthouse ceremony was beautiful, with Sophie wearing a purple dress she'd chosen herself, comfortable and age-appropriate, twirling with joy as the judge declared her officially Sophie Anderson. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply said, "Thank you for giving me a family that loves me right." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Our neighborhood slowly healed from the trauma of that Halloween revelation. The families who defended Rebecca initially came to understand the truth and apologized for their judgment. Harold moved away after his divorce, unable to face the community knowing we all knew about his involvement with Rebecca. New families moved in who knew nothing of the drama, and life gradually returned to a new kind of normal. We instituted new protocols for community events, including background checks for adult participants and clear guidelines about child safety. What had started as a nightmare became a catalyst for positive change, making our neighborhoods safer for all children. We became more vigilant, more willing to speak up when something didn't feel right, understanding that protecting children sometimes requires uncomfortable conversations and actions. Rebecca served 7 years of her 15-year sentence before being released on parole. We were notified of her release and immediately reinstated protective orders. She was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Sophie or any of the witnesses from the trial. Her parole conditions included registering as a sex offender, regular check-ins, and absolutely no unsupervised contact with minors. She tried to rebuild her image, starting a blog about wrongful convictions and prison reform, carefully avoiding any mention of her actual crimes. But the internet doesn't forget, and anyone who Googled her name found the truth. She moved to a different state eventually, still maintaining her innocence, still blaming everyone but herself for her downfall. But she had no power anymore, no child to exploit, no facade to maintain. She was just another registered offender trying to convince people she was the real victim. Sophie, meanwhile, thrived. By the time she was 10, you'd never know the trauma she'd endured unless you looked very closely. She excelled in school, had a close group of friends, played soccer and violin with enthusiasm, if not particular skill. She still had therapy sessions, still occasionally struggled with self-image and people-pleasing, but she was learning healthy coping mechanisms and had a strong support system. Last month was the 5-year anniversary of that Halloween night. Sophie, now 11 and nearly as tall as me, participated in the neighborhood trick-or-treating event I still organize. She dressed as a scientist, just like Emma had years before, comfortable and confident in her lab coat and safety goggles. Watching her race from house to house with her friends, laughing and being silly, was a powerful reminder of why we'd fought so hard to protect her. At one point during the evening, she ran up to me to show me her candy haul, and I noticed she was wearing a small butterfly pin on her costume. When I commented on it, she smiled and said it was her reminder that people helped her transform into who she was meant to be. The Andersons later told me she'd insisted on wearing something butterfly-related every Halloween since that night, her way of honoring the moment her life changed for the better. As I write this story, I'm watching my own children, now teenagers, doing their homework at the kitchen table. Emma is applying to colleges, thinking about majoring in social work inspired by Sophie's story. Lucas is building another contraption, this time claiming it's a time machine. They're good kids who understand that standing up for others isn't always easy but is always necessary. I've thought long and hard about sharing this story publicly. Part of me wanted to protect Sophie's privacy, to let her move forward without the shadow of her past following her. But I've come to believe that stories like this need to be told, that other communities need to understand that predators don't always look like strangers in vans offering candy. Sometimes they look like successful suburban mothers, beautiful and charming and utterly convincing in their deception. If you take nothing else from this story, please understand that children rarely lie about abuse, but they often lack the vocabulary to clearly express what's happening to them. Listen to the things they say. Pay attention to behaviors that seem off. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't be silenced by social pressure or fear of causing drama. The temporary discomfort of being wrong is nothing compared to the lifetime of trauma a child suffers when no one intervenes. Understand, too, that abusers are often master manipulators who know exactly how to present themselves to avoid suspicion. Rebecca had crafted a perfect image that allowed her to exploit Sophie for years. She used her beauty, wealth, and social status as shields, counting on people's reluctance to challenge someone who seemed to have it all together. She weaponized social niceties and people's desire to avoid confrontation, creating a safe space for her abuse to continue. But also remember that communities have power when they stand together. No single person brought down Rebecca's house of cards. It took all of us sharing our observations, supporting each other through her retaliation, and refusing to be silenced by her threats. It took professionals who listened and acted, a legal system that eventually worked, and foster parents willing to help a traumatized child heal. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to protect one. Today, Sophie Anderson is a thriving 11-year-old who loves science and soccer, who has sleepovers with friends and complains about homework like any other kid. She still has challenges, wounds that may never fully heal, but she also has love, safety, and a future that belongs to her alone. She's living proof that early intervention can save lives, that children can recover from trauma with proper support, and that speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves is always worth the risk. Our annual Halloween celebration continues to be a highlight of the neighborhood calendar. I still organize it, still send out those same cheerful messages about costume comfort and safety. But now there's an underlying vigilance, a community understanding that protecting our children requires more than just checking for razors in candy. It requires paying attention, speaking up, and sometimes risking social comfort for a child's safety. When new families move to the neighborhood, they're welcomed warmly, but also educated subtly about our community standards. Not through gossipy warnings about what happened with Rebecca, but through positive modeling of appropriate adult-child interactions, clear communication about boundaries, and a culture that prioritizes child safety over adult comfort. We've learned that prevention is always better than intervention. Sometimes I drive past Rebecca's old house, now home to a lovely family with 3 children who play freely in the yard. The perfect lawn is a little less perfect now, scattered with bikes and soccer balls and sidewalk chalk. The windows that once hid such darkness now frame scenes of normal family life. It's a powerful reminder that houses don't hold evil, people do, and that healing is possible even in places where harm once lived. I've stayed in touch with Detective Chen, who tells me our case has become a training example for recognizing grooming behaviors and the importance of community reporting. She says what struck her most was how many people had noticed something off but hadn't felt empowered to act until that Halloween night brought everything to a head. Our story has helped other communities identify and intervene in similar situations, a legacy I never wanted but am proud to have. The other mothers from that night remain some of my closest friends. We share a bond forged in crisis, strengthened by shared purpose, and maintained through genuine affection. Maria and I walk together every morning, processing not just that traumatic Halloween, but all the challenges of raising children in an imperfect world. Jennifer started a local organization focused on child safety education. Tom and his wife became foster parents themselves, inspired by the Andersons' example. We don't talk about Rebecca often anymore. She's become a cautionary tale, a reminder of vigilance needed, but not a presence in our daily lives. When her name comes up, it's usually in the context of lessons learned or protocols established. She has no power over us now, no ability to harm another child in our community. That's the only victory that matters. As I finish sharing this story, I want to leave you with hope. Yes, there are Rebeccas in this world, people who would exploit innocence for their own gain. But there are far more people like the families in our neighborhood who rallied to protect Sophie, like the Andersons who opened their home and hearts to a traumatized child, like the professionals who believed a little girl's truth and acted to save her. If you're reading this and something resonates, if there's a child in your life who seems to be struggling, who says things that don't quite add up, who shows signs of fear or discomfort around certain adults, please don't look away. Talk to professionals, document your concerns, be willing to be wrong if it means potentially saving a child. The temporary discomfort of overreacting pales in comparison to the lifelong trauma of abuse. And if you're reading this as a survivor of childhood exploitation, please know that healing is possible. Sophie is living proof that with support, therapy, and love, children can overcome even the most calculated betrayal by those meant to protect them. Your story matters, your healing matters, and you deserved so much better than what you received. Halloween in our neighborhood will never be quite the same as it was before that fateful night. There's an awareness now, a vigilance that runs beneath the surface joy of children in costumes collecting candy. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe protecting innocence requires acknowledging that threats exist, that sometimes the monster is hiding behind a perfect smile and designer clothes. This year, as I watched Sophie race from house to house with her friends, her scientist costume glowing under the streetlights, her laughter carrying on the autumn air, I saw not just a survivor but a thriver. I saw the power of community action, the importance of listening to children, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. I saw Hope dressed in a lab coat and safety goggles, carrying a pillowcase full of candy and a heart full of joy. That's the image I want to leave you with. Not Rebecca's rage or Sophie's tears from that horrible night, but Sophie Anderson today, 11 years old, safe, loved, and free. Free to be a child, free to trust adults, free to wear whatever makes her comfortable, free to say no, free to just be herself. That freedom, hard-won and fiercely protected, is what makes every difficult moment of this journey worthwhile. Thank you for reading this story in its entirety. It wasn't easy to share, and I'm sure it wasn't easy to read. But these stories need to be told, these warnings need to be heard, and these victories need to be celebrated. Sophie's story could have ended so differently if even one person had chosen silence over action. Instead, it became a story of community courage, professional dedication, and the triumph of love over exploitation. Hold your children close tonight. Tell them they're loved for who they are, not what they look like or what they can do for others. Teach them that their comfort and safety matter more than anyone's approval. Show them through your actions that you'll believe them, protect them, and fight for them if needed. And remember that sometimes being the villain in someone else's story means being the hero in a child's life. Our neighborhood is stronger now, our children safer, our bonds deeper. We learned that evil can wear designer clothes and drive luxury cars, but we also learned that good people standing together can overcome any evil. We learned that children's voices matter, that community vigilance works, and that love, real love, protects rather than exploits. Sophie Anderson is proof that intervention works, that children can heal, that the cycle of abuse can be broken. Every time I see her butterfly pin, every time she waves at me during trick-or-treating, every time she just gets to be a normal kid, I'm reminded that some fights are worth having, some stands are worth taking, and some children are lucky enough to be saved by a community that refused to look away. This is our story, mine and Sophie's and our entire neighborhood's. It's a story of horror and hope, of masks and revelations, of a Halloween that changed everything. Most of all, it's a reminder that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, that intuition should be trusted, and that standing up for the vulnerable is always, always the right thing to do, no matter the cost. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to speak up when something feels wrong. Somewhere, a child like Sophie might be waiting for someone like you to notice, to care, to act. Be that person. Be the one who refuses to be silenced by social pressure or legal threats. Be the one who chooses a child's safety over your own comfort. Be the one who makes sure the monsters hiding behind perfect smiles can't hurt anyone else. Because in the end, that's how we protect our children and our communities. Not by pretending evil doesn't exist, but by standing together against it when we find it. Not by maintaining polite silence, but by speaking truth even when it's uncomfortable. Not by assuming someone else will handle it, but by taking responsibility ourselves. Sophie is safe today because a community chose courage over comfort. May we all have such courage when our moment comes.